Welcome back to another Telltale Books video. I'm Greg, and this is kind of a special video I'm doing. Something I decided kind of last minute. It relates to the fact that my next Stephen King, as I'm reading things, as I'm doing these videos, the next in my Stephen King read through is the short story The Gunslinger. Now, The Gunslinger was inspired by a poem by Robert Browning, Child Roland to the Dark Tower Came. And that poem in turn was inspired by the French epic poem from the 11th century, the Song of Roland. So I'm going all the way back and reading the Song of Roland. Something I've always wanted to read, and I never have gotten around to it. And hey, there's no time like the present. So I took the time, I read it. I have it in a copy of a modern library book, Medieval Epics. It's got Beowulf, the Song of Roland, the Nibelungenlied, and El Cid. Very good book. I don't know how collectible that is. It's got a really boring cover, and all the modern library in those years, all these books, hardcover books that they produced of the classics, they all had the same cover design. Different titles, of course, but always the same cover design. But the book itself is good. The Song of Roland specifically is translated by W.S. Merwin. And it was I think it was a good translation. Of course, I don't read French, so I can't go back to the original and compare and see if I think he made mistakes. Because I just don't know. I have to trust that, but W.S. Merwin is someone that I've heard of before. He also did El Cid in this book. He's a noted scholar, so I think he probably did a really good job. And this translation of the Song of Roland, it's not, the original is poetry. This is done as prose. It's highly readable today. It's highly readable for modern audiences. And I enjoyed it a lot. I think it was accurate to the poem because it seemed to have a poetic rhyme to it, even though it was prose. I thought it was enjoyable to read, easy to read. The one thing I'm finding about everything before Shakespeare is that I've started realizing this because I also read the Decameron recently, or at least part of it, and I'm seeing where literature before Shakespeare tends to be low on character. It tends to be low on characterization. It tends to be low on emotion and motivations. So much of what we expect in a story today is absent from these stories, and what you have left is just the action, the events, the plot. And everything I'm reading from before Shakespeare seems to follow this pattern where it lacks humanity, it lacks feeling, it lacks depth of character, it lacks character viewpoint, never tries to get into the character's mind, but instead is just a description of the progression of events that happened, and of course how the characters reacted to those events. So there are times when they're crying or they're sad or they're angry or whatever, but very basic emotions, because these they're told. You got to remember, a lot of these were originally related vocally, verbally, before anybody ever wrote them down. For some years, a lot of these old medieval epics and before were told verbally. In the case of Song of Roland, it was a poem. It may have actually been a song. It may have actually been sung. It may have had music. So it may have been performed by a wandering minstrel. So the structure of their stories is not like we do today. Structure of their stories is very different from what we do today. And you have to bear that in mind when you read these things, because it's not going to be like reading Brandon Sanderson. It's going to be very different. But, well, the Song of Roland, the oldest known manuscript existing, dates from somewhere between 1129 and 1165, but it was written before then. The original poem, the scholars believe, was written sometime between 1040 AD and 1115 AD. And one of the oldest manuscripts at the end seems to ascribe the poem as having been composed by somebody named Turoldus. But there's no other historical record of any Turoldus at that time. So nobody is 100% sure of that, but I'm going to run with it, and I'm going to guesstimate 1090 and by Turoldus. It does relate to real history. The battle talked about in this poem really did happen. I'm not sure if Roland was a real character in it, but the battle itself actually did happen. The Battle of Roncesvalles Pass. And it happened at the end of Charlemagne's campaign into Spain against the Muslims in 778 AD. Now, the reason I am arbitrarily picking 1090 as the time of the poem has to do with speculation that the poem may have been written as like propaganda to stir up French patriotism and bolster support for the First Crusade, which happened from 1096 to 1099. So that time frame, it would make sense, because reading this poem, it's loaded with patriotic sentiment towards France and towards Charlemagne and towards Roland and towards Christianity and the church, and the Muslims are these monsters. It's very much like propaganda. So it seems to me that the people that think that may be what this poem is all about, I think they may be spot on with that. And the poem became France's national epic. Okay, this is that story that they point to when they're trying to bolster patriotism in France. It's kind of like talking about George Washington crossing the Delaware in the United States. So this poem sits in a point of historical significance. It has a great deal of importance to the nation of France and to the people of France and the culture of France. It's a very, very old poem dating back almost a full 1,000 years. Almost a full 1,000 years since this poem would have been written. Now, the specific account of the battle in this poem, the details of it, are not really, at least what I've read, I'm not a historian, but what I read is that the specific details of the battle are not really supported by other historical records of the battle. So this may have been made up embellishment, and that supports the idea of it being propaganda if it was made up to make the French look better than they really were in this battle. But the battle did happen, and the battle did go south. So the story. Roland is the nephew of Emperor Charlemagne. And Charlemagne listens to Roland when Roland states who should go and meet with King Marsilian. Marsilian is a king in the mountains of Spain. He lords over a city in the mountains of Spain that you have to cross to get over into France. So that's what Charlemagne's army has done. They're going up through these mountains and they're camped there. And Marsilian is looking to strike at Charlemagne. But he requests that somebody be sent to him. So Roland tells Charlemagne he should send Ganelon. Now Ganelon is Roland's stepfather. Okay. And the two of them don't get along at all. So of course he's pissed that Roland chooses him to go to meet with King Marsilian. But he goes, and he strikes a deal with Marsilian that he will make sure that Roland and all of the best French knights are left as the rear guard as the rest of the French army moves on through a pass, that they will be there guarding the rear, and Marsilian can raise a huge army and strike at them. And so Ganelon does this. He goes back, tells Charlemagne that Roland should be leading the rear guard, and that these 12 other great knights should be there with him. And that's exactly what happens. They're there. They have a sizable army, but Marsilian raises a much larger army, though nowhere near as good of fighters, of course. So Roland's relatively smaller army does a lot of damage, but is ultimately defeated. Everybody's killed. Roland dies in battle. All of Roland's friends, the best knights of France, they all die in battle. But Roland blows his horn, and Charlemagne hears it and brings the rest of the French army back to try and help them. But of course they're too late. They get there, everybody's dead. But the King Marsilian's army was very badly hurt by this. It was almost a draw between the two armies. But there's an emir from Persia, I think, came in a bunch of ships with a just huge army. And this emir then comes to Marsilian's aid against Charlemagne's army, but Charlemagne's army kicks butt and wins the day. And, but they lose a lot of great people. But they go back to France, where Ganelon is being held as a traitor because Charlemagne figured that one out. And they give him a trial, but of course he's found guilty and he is executed, along with 30 of his relatives. And Charlemagne, by the way, personally killed the emir in the big battle. So what did I think of the Song of Roland? Unlike the Decameron, I enjoyed reading this one a lot more, mainly because even though there isn't a whole lot of genuine human emotion, there's a lot of very kind of general emotion of people being mad or sad or fainting or stuff like that. Not a lot of really deep character motivation, character background, feelings, and character thoughts. You know, there's not hardly any of that in this, because they didn't do that back then. They described the events, but the description of the events of the battle is awesome. It gets into a lot of gritty detail. I mean, you have descriptions of people's brains spilling out when they get hit and fall off their horse, and their head hits the rocks, and their brains, you know, the level of gore is really high in this, to the point where, not that I'm an expert at grimdark, I have to admit I haven't read much of that yet, and so don't know a whole lot about what real grimdark is, but it seems to me that the kind of details of this battle are very much like what you would find in a grimdark story, and the story itself, I mean, it's just, so many people die. I mean, yeah, Charles wins in the end, but it's not a positive story. Nothing's repaired. You know, there's no happy ending here, really. Just a lot of people got killed, and Charles just happens to not be one of them that got killed, and he goes and executes the guy that was a traitor to all of France, and you know, his army has been greatly depleted of great warriors. Lots of people dead all over the place. The other side suffered huge losses. I mean, hundreds of thousands of people dead. I mean, it's just the amount of death and destruction here is just awe-inspiring, and so that's why I say this could be seen as kind of a precursor to today's grimdark fantasy, even though it's, well, it's fiction, but it's not really fantasy. You don't have fantastic creatures, and it is a fictionalized account of a real event, so it's more historical fiction than fantasy, but it still has that very dark tone. Eat lots of evil people. Things are not good for Roland, and then he dies. I mean, it's not a really upbeat, positive kind of story. It's very dark, very gritty, very depressing. But that makes it great. That makes it really exciting. The level of detail of the battle makes it really exciting. Now, I wouldn't, if you're a lover of real grimdark today, I wouldn't just run out and think you're going to get the exact same thing out of this. It is medieval. It is 1,000 years old. It's very different from today's writing. You have to understand that, and you have to take that into account when you go into reading it. But if you do, I think you'll find that this is a really, really enjoyable, interesting precursor to the kinds of things that we love today. For its time, it's absolutely brilliant. And I'm giving this one a top tail. This is 5 stars all the way. This is great. This is great literature. This is something you should experience, if for no other reason than the historical significance alone of where this stands in literature. At this point, not exactly sure what this has to do with Stephen King's Dark Tower series, other than the name Roland. Very soon after this video premieres on YouTube, I am going to put up a video, which is me reading the Robert Browning poem. Robert Browning got the name of Childe Roland from the Song of Roland. And then Stephen King based his character Roland in the Dark Tower on Childe Roland to the Dark Tower Came by Robert Browning. So that's the path I'm going through. I'm not going to do an analysis of the Browning poem. I'm going to let you think about it. And then I have it scheduled so that I put up that poem and my review of The Gunslinger on the same day. Now, when I say The Gunslinger, you got to understand, The Gunslinger is the title of the first book in the Dark Tower series, but that book is a collection of novelettes that Stephen King wrote and published in the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction between 1978 and I think 1982. The very first story that he published relating to the Dark Tower, and the very first story in the book The Gunslinger, is a story titled The Gunslinger, and that's what I'm going to be talking about. I'm doing this in order of publication, and The Gunslinger was published in the October 1978 issue of the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction, which was the very first science fiction magazine that I ever bought. And I do have a copy. And I hope you'll come back and join me for all that. If you've read the Song of Roland or know things about the Song of Roland that you think should be added to this video, or have other perceptions of what I'm talking about here, please leave comments in the comment section. That's how I learn. That's how everybody learns. That's how all this stuff grows. This should be a more of a community interaction on this stuff, not just me trying to be an expert, because I'm not. So leave your comments so that we all can enjoy and learn from them. And hit the like button, hit the subscribe button so that you can come back and see the Child Roland poem and the review of Stephen King's The Gunslinger coming up very shortly on this channel.